We're in the book of Haggai. The theme of Haggai is 2 chapters about building the temple. And of course, just backgrounds, we all know where we are, is just the next part of this process. After the 70 years of captivity, we have the decree in Ezra chapter 1. We got the decree of Cyrus that sent the Israelites back home. It had been 70 years. We talked about this even in the book of Daniel, how Daniel had recognized by reading Jeremiah, who also talked about Cyrus and the 70 years. This was, the timing was right, so Daniel began to pray, and that's why we have that, we discussed Sunday. And Haggai comes after that. It's in the second year of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month. That's in verse 1. So this is when people were sent back to build the temple, and the temple was in ruin. The whole place is in ruins, and they had come to a point when they stopped. And you can read some of the other passages in Zechariah and other passages that talk about the reason for that. There's quite a few things that happened. A lot of political things going on, but it stopped for a while, and Haggai was sent to get them going and to make sure that they build it like they were told to do, like they should be doing. That is that's the message. The theme is then, if we do what the Lord wants, we'll find the blessings that He promised. So this is actually the first record of preaching after the Babylonian exile. And Haggai addressed those who were returning from exile and their leaders, Joshua and Zerubbabel. Haggai means my feast. I think it kind of relates to the idea of creating this tabernacle, this temple for God, and for that. I don't know if the name really means anything beyond that, but it could be symbolic. His sermons were delivered over the course of 4 months in 520 BC. So this was 16 years after the return from exile. So they went home. 16 years later, the temple still isn't built. And this is why he's sent, and he's preaching for a total of 4 months. So the outline of the book is chapter 1 is about the starting of the rebuilding, the proclamation that he needs to rebuild, that they need to rebuild, and then in verse 12 it starts with Zerubbabel and Joshua. Zerubbabel was the leader, and Joshua was the high priest. And they obeyed the voice of the Lord their God in the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the presence of the Lord. So then in chapter 2, we've got the building, the application of this, and the promises that are actually given to them that they will continue on if they will do the things that God wanted them to do, which is building the temple. And then at the end of this chapter, in chapter 2, we have the building of the confidence of Zerubbabel, possibly reference to the Messiah, which we can talk about. That's in verses 20 and 23, 20 through 23. And this is building, not that he necessarily needed the confidence, but the people needed the confidence in him. And so that's what that's about. So that's a summary of the book. And Haggai chapter 1 and verse 4 is kind of the theme, the idea here. It says, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses and this temple to lie in ruins?" And that's a great question, and it illustrates exactly what's going on in the situation that they're in. It illustrates the problem very well, and gets to the point that we need to see, and we can see the implications of this. So if you look in verse 4, what does it mean that they have paneled houses? And what does that imply in the context? Yeah. So we might not think of paneled houses as being that big a deal, right? Paneling, in fact, we would probably look at it and go, that's old. That's not that big a deal. But in the 70s, that was the thing. And this is not, I'm sure, I have no idea. I'm speaking just from my assumptions. I'm sure it's not this paneling that's like an eighth of an inch thick that we're talking about here. Would be probably fine wood. This is a time of luxury. This is a time of they're building and taking care of their own houses, and it may not be richness, but it could be. But it's still, the idea is they finished their houses and they're comfortable, and they haven't even touched the Lord's house. So that's the problem. So what is the implication of that? That they have paneled houses. What does it imply? All right. Yeah. Yeah, their priorities are out of line. So their time, their priorities, everything is out of whack because they're doing these things. There's nothing wrong with living in paneled houses, is there? No. But we have to have the right things in the right order, right? And they were told to build the temple. I don't know how long it would take for you to build a house with paneling. I suspect it wouldn't take 16 years. So what were they doing after their houses were built? This is the point. They just weren't doing what they should be doing. They were worrying about life instead of worrying about the right things. I think that's it. So the underlying, what would you say would be the underlying problem then? Self, priorities, yeah. Materialism, that was my first thought, but all of those are right. I think you're absolutely right. It's selfishness, materialism, pride, and I don't know. I suppose we can probably relate to that, right? We might have some problems now and then with the idea of it. So I think those are underlying problems and issues that we struggle with. We always struggle with, and the idea of priorities is a difficult one. It's not. If it were really easy, we wouldn't have that much of a problem with it. But good, honest, hardworking people can find themselves with priorities that are wrong and not even realize it. That's the way it works. And the reason is because we can say we fight against materialism all we want to, but we still have to have material things. And we all know that. So we have a struggle with the balance. And I think we can maybe get some insights here tonight about how we can combat that and maybe give us some ideas for how we can have the right focus in our own lives. So if you look in with me then in verses 5 through 11, this is what was being said. Now therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but do not have enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put it into a bag with holes. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build a temple, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, but indeed it came to little. And when you brought it home, it blew away. I blew it away. Why, says the Lord of hosts? Because of my house that is in ruins, while every one of you runs to his own house. Therefore the heavens above you withhold the dew, and the earth withholds its fruit. For I called for a drought on the land and the mountains, on the grain and the new wine and the oil, on whatever the ground brings forth, on men and livestock, and on all labor of your hands. All right. What should have been the clue that something was wrong? Or what is the evidence he's giving them that they should know something is wrong? They're not getting anywhere in life, all right? So I love the description here. Johnny Ramsey, one time, he preached a sermon. I still remember at least the title of it. He called it a bag with holes. And that's what we did. We put our money in a bag and it just flows out. Do we have similar issues in our culture?
What they do on the accumulation and paying of great debts, as opposed to actually just, I guess, the conventional model of debt has
Well, yeah, that's right. Debt is a major problem that we face, right? And that's part of the reason we would have a bag with holes, so to speak. The idea is that, of course, that, if you find yourself in a situation where you have more month than money, then there's something that needs to be changed, right? There's some kind of a shift that has to take place, and they weren't getting it. So what typically happens, just think of us as Americans, what typically happens if we have more month than money? What happens to the month? We put it on a credit card, yeah, or we put it into more debt, and then if you get a raise, let's suppose you get a substantial raise, and it's 5% maybe, which is not really that much, but you get a 5% raise. What happens to your level of expenses? It goes up 6 or 7%. That's how we operate. We'll go out and we'll see I got that much buffer. I can go get a car for that much. And then we wonder where all of our money goes, right? I'm not preaching to the choir. This is me. I know exactly how that works. So we have to be really careful with that. He talks about the fact that you sow much and you bring in little. You eat but do not have enough. You drink but you're not filled with drink. There's more symptoms there, right? Have you ever been in a position where you eat but you don't actually have enough to eat? It doesn't happen very often in our culture, right? It does happen. Now, there are people who go hungry, and they don't know where their next meal is coming from. But most of us in this country, live pretty well. And here's the thing: the bigger we get as a country, the bigger our waistlines get, the more we eat. Right? It's the same thing. We have more room in our stomach to put more food. So now what do? I eat more food. That's what we do. And there's an indication there. So we can see this in two ways. We can see this as we're doing things, we're planting crops, but we have a lot of them fail. Or we can see this as we have a lot of the same crops. We have the crops that are growing, but it's not enough because of our appetite that gets bigger. Either way, this is a bad place to be, right? So God says that in verse 9, he says, it came to little. You looked for much, but indeed it came to little. When you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Because of my house that is in ruins, while every one of you runs to his own house. All right, pretty interesting idea. Why do you suppose... Before I ask that question, let me ask a simpler question. Did God need a temple to live in? Does God need a temple to live in? No. In fact, when Solomon built the temple, do you remember what he said about it? That a temple couldn't contain God. God who does not dwell in temples made with hands. Exactly. It's not as if he needed a house to live in. That's universally true. His home is not here, it's in heaven. Okay? So why would he be upset if they didn't build him a house? Okay, he told them to build it. Why did he tell them to build it? Okay, essentially they weren't filling the law. Yeah. Which they needed a temple. What went on at the temple? We know what that is. The worship, sacrifices, right? They needed the temple so that they could function in the way God wanted them to function. And I'm just stating the obvious, I know. So I ask a question, and sometimes I'm too obvious with the questions. But when we look at that means that they hadn't. Does that mean that they weren't making sacrifices? I don't know. You can make sacrifices without having a temple. They didn't have to have the temple complex. They could have had the altar out there. It's a possibility. But it indicates their lack of resolve. It indicates their lack of priorities. So the reason that God, in my estimation, the reason that God came down on them for this wasn't because he didn't have a house per se. It was because of the reason he didn't have a house. And that is they've spent 16 years patting their own beds and not worrying about him, which is a very serious situation, right? So does that indicate then their relationship with God? Yeah, it impacts their relationship with God. And it indicates, in a relationship, and I don't mean to insult God by comparing our relationship like a human relationship, but there are some similarities. In a relationship, how do you know whether or not the relationship is thriving? Well, there's a couple ways you could do it. You could test it, right? We can look at a checklist and say, so a husband and a wife. A wife makes a checklist of all the things that she wants her husband to do, and when she checks off all those boxes, that means that they have a good relationship. Is that true? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that he decided to do what you wanted, maybe because he loves you and wants to help, or maybe because he didn't want to hear it when he doesn't do it. Those are very different ideas, right? So while those can be indicators, they're not necessarily good tests. So do we have tests in the church do we have those kind of boxes that we check to judge whether we're faithful in a relationship with God? Yeah, we do. What would they be? Nobody wants to say, do they? All right, walking in the doors. Yeah. Now, is it important for a husband and wife relationship if one of the boxes that needs to be checked off from the wife is that he kisses her goodbye when he goes to work? Is that important? Yes, it is. So we're not diminishing anything, but we're simply saying that's not a good barometer. It's something you would expect if the relationship was going well, but it's not an indicator of a good relationship necessarily. And we know that, right? So if people walk in the door, is that an indication of a good relationship to God? No, it's not. It is what you would expect to see, of course. If you are thinking that you can avoid coming in the doors and having an assembly, and sitting in the assembly with the saints and have a good relationship with God, you're completely mistaken. That's not possible because the scriptures are very plain about that. But how many people have come in those doors who are ungodly and following Satan the rest of the week? Does it indicate that they're right with God for that 1 hour that they're in here? No. It's not a good indication. So we have that. We have the board in the back too, right? That relates to that. That says how many people were here. We judge our success as a congregation based on whether that number is increasing or decreasing. And that number could be the number of people or it could be the number of money. Both of those would you expect if Christians are faithful, would you expect the numbers to be good? Of course. Having good numbers does not mean you're faithful, though. And that's a very different idea. So this is what we look at. Having a temple didn't necessarily, it's not like a checkbox, but it's an indication of a problem. And he's addressing the problem directly. He's hitting their pocketbooks, which is the source of their problems. It's their materialism. Yeah, I like talking about this, but we have to be careful. I don't want to suggest that none of these things are important by any means. But I want to tell you a little parable. It's a little parable of a man who bought a new car, and he checked the oil, and the oil was a little low. And he got concerned about it. So he checked it again next week, and it was just a little bit lower. He said, I don't like this trend. So he took the top off of the dipstick, the top that sits at the top, and you pull it out. He took it off and welded a piece of metal about an inch, stuck it back on and stuck it back in. Lo and behold, the oil was fine.
Kind of like daylight savings time.
Yeah, daylight savings time. You cut in, or as one, there's one American Indian who said, white men are so dumb. They think if you take a foot off the top of a blanket and sew it to the bottom, it makes the blanket longer. So he was just joking, but still. Yeah, so those just illustrate a point, and that is we have to test, but we have to be careful how we test, right? That man was not making the right assessments. And so we have to look at ourselves. We can look at the numbers, and that's an easy one to look at. But there are a lot of things we need to look at for ourselves. Can you read the Bible every day and still be unfaithful to God? Of course. Would you expect it if you're a faithful Christian? Yeah, you would expect some interaction with God, praying and reading the Bible. But who was it? Khrushchev. Was it Khrushchev?
Yeah, Khrushchev.
He had the...
Over 2/3 of the New Testament.
Yeah, he had the New Testament memorized.
He just spit it out.
And I don't know if it was 2/3. I was told the whole thing. I have no idea. But I know I don't have 2/3 of the Bible memorized. Does anybody in here have it? I used to have several books of the Bible memorized, and I realized it wasn't doing me much good. But so I haven't done it, haven't thought about it in a long time. But does that mean that you're faithful? Obviously not. Atheists know the Bible. Satan knows the Bible better than a whole lot of Christians knows the Bible, right? And certainly doesn't mean anything. So anyway, the point is that we have all these different criteria that we use to rate ourselves, and if we're not careful, they become a way to make ourselves feel better about ourselves instead of an indicator of a relationship that we have. And we all know that. This is why I said earlier, good, strong, faithful people can end up in the wrong place, not even realizing that they're there, because we forget what these indicators are indicating. I think that's an important idea. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit more. What in verses 5 through 11, how would they know what to attribute those problems to? Now, Haggai had to come and tell them, but how would they know if he didn't tell them? I'm not trying to make it a trick question. It actually we actually have a phrase in here twice. Consider your ways, yes. If they would have taken the time to think about what they were doing, they would have understood this, right? Why in the world am I losing money? Why in the world is it I'm doing all this stuff and I don't seem to be able to get ahead? Yeah, going all the way back to Deuteronomy. Was it Deuteronomy, or it may be Numbers? We have the blessings and the curses. It could have been in Exodus. I think there's some reading in there about that too. The blessings and the curses that were going to come because of their either following God or not following God. And the list of curses was a lot longer than the list of blessings because that's human nature. That's where we are. So that's an important idea. He says, consider your ways in verse 5, and then he says in verse 7, consider your ways. And so sooner or later, we have to take a step back and think about ourselves. Now, if you're having difficult times, does that mean that your relationship with God is on the rocks? No. That's why you have to think about it, right? But the time that we look at ourselves and think, I don't got to worry about that part of it, that's the time we need to worry about it. So look in the book of 2 Corinthians, the last chapter. It's actually the last, I think it's the last verse of the Bible. No, it's not last, but it is in this last chapter 13 and verse 5. Examine yourselves as to whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you are disqualified. Now, just from the surface reading of this, why were they supposed to test themselves? What were they looking for? To see whether or not they were disqualified. What does disqualified mean? Not walking in the light, not walking in the right way. Yeah. So why would Paul tell them that they needed to test themselves? I know it's a really obvious question, but let's talk about it. Yes. Regular self-assessment is necessary to remain on the course. So maintenance, yeah. Maintenance is something that we, if we neglect it, we're going to pay for it.
No matter what we do in life, okay, if we want to be good at it, we have to evaluate, okay?
Very good.
How good are we at it?
Yeah.
And the same certainly holds true for our relationship with God.
I think you're right. If you want to, so we have two different ideas going on here. They're the same idea, but they're two different. It's the same, different sides of the same coin. One, we watch ourselves so that we can make sure we're not drifting away from God. But the other way is, like you said, if we assess ourselves, we can see how we can develop and grow. So, for example, a good sprinter, you know what they will do in order to prepare for races? They will film themselves, watch themselves, and test different things. They will look at even the way that their ankle, the way that one ankle moves in comparison with the other. In fact, they have it. I don't know how this is true. I don't know how they know this, but supposedly one ankle is supposed to pronate a little bit, and the other one's supposed to stay solid. If you can do that, then you're going to have a faster race. How would you know that? Well, they tested it, and they figured out, hey, these are things that I can do to improve. So, yeah, we test ourselves to see if we're in the faith, and this is what he's talking about here, but we also test ourselves because then we find out, well, what's working, right? Have you ever, you do this as your job, hopefully. You can look at yourself and say, am I really a good employee? And then we all are going to say, of course we are. Of course I am, right? But how would you know unless you actually figured out a way to test whether or not you actually were? I read a bulletin article one time that said if you treated the church like you treated your job, how long would you have it? How long would you have your job? Well, no. You treat the job like you treat the church. How long would you have your job? What does that mean? It means, are we accountable? Do we actually show up when we're supposed to? Do we do the things that we say we're going to do? Are we just here half-heartedly, or are we actually engaged and enthused in doing what we're supposed to be doing? Those are great questions to ask. And if you don't go to your job and have a little bit of enthusiasm, at least a little bit, right, you're going to have a hard time promoting and maybe even having a hard time keeping your job. Although, from what I remember, if you go and just give an ounce of energy, you're doing better than most of the people around you. I realize that. But there's a little bit of strife that has to go in there. Yeah, Joe?
Jason, professional slavery, when I say professional slavery, I'm talking about guys and gals that go to sea win a house alone, right? They will meticulously trim the sail to get even a quarter of a knot increase in speed.
That's a good illustration of that. So I have no idea about sailing, but so you can tweak those sails to get a little bit more oomph in there, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense. And we kind of do all kinds of things like that. Is there an indication, is there a verse that comes to mind that might fit that idea? And I'm thinking about sails or maybe a race. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And he even talks about this as a race. He says in verse 24, Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself may become disqualified. What would it be like if we had to compete with each other to go to heaven? And only the best one could go. Imagine how you would act if you had to be a better Christian than everyone around you. What would that even look like? I don't think Paul is saying here that we have this competition, but he's saying we treat it like a runner treats a competition. When that guy or girl, when they hit that starter pistol and they take off, they're not doing this as if everyone gets a prize. They're doing this knowing that if he wants the prize, he's going to have to push it and work hard. And what does he mean by that? Well, it's not about hardness of work. It's in this context, he's talking about being temperate in all things. This is about the training process. Okay, so what does it mean to be temperate? Self-control, yes. So we have self-control, and that is that we learn how to say no to the right things, right? And a good runner, or any people who compete, they know how to say no to the things that they should say no to, and how to say yes to the right things. And that's a really important idea. So when we look at this back in Haggai, let's go back there. There's a lot we can say about this, and it comes down to analyzation, looking at ourselves. And incidentally, what I didn't say about 2 Corinthians 13:5, examine yourselves, it's in the present tense. It's not future examination. It's not having examined yourself in the past. It is in the Greek, the force of the present tense is that it's a continuous action. This is something that we're doing. It's not necessarily something that we do and then we're done. It's a doing. Right. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things, hold fast that which is good. And that's in the context of prophecy, but it still relates to any other thing. And, 1 John 4:1, test the spirits, see whether they're of God. There's a lot of passages that deal with this idea. And Haggai dealt with it, I think, in a really good way. So modern applications, this is the key themes. There's three basic ideas. I think we've already touched on them. That is materialism versus spiritual priorities, our responsibility to God and community, and consequences of neglecting spiritual duties. So let's talk about materialism. Material versus spiritual priorities. What passage in the New Testament teaches us to have the right priorities? There's more than one. Now, I ask that so you can say. Matthew 6:33. Yeah, that's the most common one we go to, right? It says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. And what are all the things that he says in that? What's that referring to? Yeah, the things that you eat, the things that you wear, right? Well, yeah, we're seeking the spiritual, right? And so we have, if we are seeking God first, the things that we need in this world are going to be provided for us. Now, realistically, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're going to have everything that we want? No. Is it possible that you will have periods of time when you might even be hungry? Yes. That doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. It's just that sometimes things happen that way. I have a friend in Africa who is occasionally he'll text me and say, "Brother, the crops we planted crops and they grew, but they just wasn't enough to feed us. What do we do? We're having famine." I hear it from a lot of people over there, having famine right now. And I've heard other people say, well, if they were faithful Christians, they wouldn't be hungry. That's a general statement. Paul David said, and I can't remember the passage, Jenna probably knows it. Psalm 37:25. I'm going to see if you're right. So if it's the same one I'm thinking about, Psalm 37:25 tells us that he says he's never seen, I've been young and now I'm old, and yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. He's ever merciful and lends, and his descendants are blessed. Do you remember when David almost killed Nabal? Do you remember that? Why was he so mad at Nabal? He refused to give David food. He had just had a feast, the feast was about to take place. It was the time of the feast. And David went to him and said, "We protected your people, your shepherds. Please give us food." Why do you think he was asking for food? Was it to celebrate the feast? No, they were hungry. They needed food. So did he contradict what he said? Of course not. We're talking, remember, in generalities. This is the way it works. So it's possible that we will be hungry. Now, we put our trust in God, and we know that he can take care of us. So let's think about this. When we come to the point where we have no food, if that were to ever happen to us, and we get really skinny, and we die of hunger, what happens to us? We go to heaven, if we're faithful. God does not forsake his people. Now, generally speaking, most of the time, we're going to be able to find food, but there are exceptions to that. We have to look for it. You don't see the whole thing, you just see a little part of it, but it's not that little part that's who you are. It's the whole thing. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. All right. So in Haggai, what can we learn from the text that will help us see if our priorities are out of alignment? We already talked about that. That is, we analyze ourselves. So let's think about this. How would you say that as Christians, one of the, especially for men, and this is, I don't mean this against women, but sometimes women they stay home and it's a little bit easier in the spiritual process of this. What is it that we can do in order for us, when we are working long hours, to ensure that we still have a relationship with God? Let me rephrase that. What attitudes can we develop about our job that will help us have a better relationship with God? Okay. So I don't have a job so that I can gain money. I have a job so that I can gain money so that I can do things with it that God wants me to do. Does that change your purpose of having a job? Of course, yeah, it does. Does that matter? Yeah, it does. It can radically alter the way you go into work. So now I have a job. Of course, are you supposed to have a job to take care of yourself? Yes. Is it good and proper and holy for you to have a job so that you can eat food? Of course, it is. Is it the only reason we have a job? It's to help people as much as we can. And this is where I step on my own toes. If we have a job and we spend all of our money so that all of our money is gone, who is it that's going to benefit from that lack of excess? Yeah. And even a person that's living to those limits, they're not really benefiting that much either, because they're feeling like they don't have enough, because they're worried because I can't pay all my bills because I'm juggling so many things, right? What if you live underneath your means? I know it's a novel concept in this world today, right? You live beneath your means. What does that do for the excess? What can you do with it? Do more good. Well, what we typically do is spend it on ourselves. But while that's not necessarily wrong, it certainly is. It comes back to the question I asked at the beginning. How long do you think it would take? Would it take 16 years to build a paneled house? No. Once you have the house built, What do you do with the other stuff? That's the great question. Sorry, fill it with stuff. That's right. So when we die, our kids get to fight over who has to sell it all. To throw it away. Yeah, they might can get a few dollars out of it with some of my stuff, but most of it's just going to go in the garbage. And I think about that. Every time I move, I think about that. I don't know how people do it. The longest I've ever lived in one place is 5 years. And when I moved from a place after 5 years, we moved out here, there's 2 people living in my house. And that truck was the biggest truck they had, and it was packed to the brim. I thought, what in the world? How did all this stuff get in my house? I don't even know how it fit in my house, honestly. And we stuffed it into this one. I can't imagine somebody moving after 30 years. But this is our culture, right? We need to be the kind of people that says we can change that. We can, instead of gathering for ourselves, we can gather for other people. And I think it needs to be a focus. Anyway, I think that really gets to the heart of what the problem is in Haggai as well, if we can think about that. Read through this if you want, and thank you very much for your participation.